Hello, everyone. So we're back again, and tonight we're continuing with our beautiful book of Love in the Time of Cholera by Gacriel Garcia Marquez. And beautiful book. We're now on page 10, actually. Before we get started, I just want to make sure that we are getting rid of any restless energy in the air from the day. No monsters under the bed. And so I'm going to light a little sage. And with that, we'll clear the air. Yeah, here we go. Oops. Hold on, it's not working. I think these matches are a little old. There we go. Awesome. Okay, here we go. Technical difficulties. It happens when you go live. Okay, so here we go. Let's clear the energy. Let's release any and all entities and energies that are not serving your highest and best. Yeah. And send all of these energies down to Mother Earth, to the crystalline core, so she can transform and transmute these energies into love and light. Clear the air, remove anything that doesn't resonate with you. Release your day and allow yourself to relax. Lower the light of your camera, of your computer or your tablet or phone, so that you can just hear my voice and allow yourself to drift off to sleep. Sometimes we have difficulty sleeping, and it's so lovely when someone can read to us. Okay, so where we left off, someone had died, and now we're trying to figure out what's actually going on. Okay, here we go. So, his daily schedule was so methodical that his wife knew where to send him a message if an emergency arose in the course of the afternoon. When he was a young man, he would stop in the parish cafe before coming home. And this was where he perfected his chess game with his father-in-law's cronies and some Caribbean refugees. But he had not returned to the parish cafe since the dawn of the new century. And he had attempted to organize national tournaments under the sponsorship of the social club. It was at this time that Jeremiah de Saint-Amour arrived. His knees already dead, not yet a photographer of children, yet in less than 3 months to everyone who knew how to move a bishop across a chessboard knew who he was. Because no one had been able to defeat him in a game. For Dr. Juvenal Urbino, it was a miraculous meeting at the very moment when chess had become an unconquerable passion for him, and he no longer had many opponents who could satisfy it. Thanks to him, Jeremiah de Saint-Amour could become what he was among us. Dr. Urbino made himself his unconditional protector, his guarantor in everything, without even taking the trouble to learn who he was or what he did or what inglorious wars he had come from in his crippled and broken state. He eventually lent him the money to set up his photography studio, and from the time he took his first picture of a child started by the magnesium flash, Jeremiah de Saint-Amour paid back every last penny with religious regularity. It was all for chess. At first they played after supper at 7 o'clock, with a reasonable handicap for Jeremiah de Saint-Amour because of his notable superiority. But the handicap was reduced until at last they played as equals. Later, when Don Galileo da Conte opened the first outdoor cinema, Jeremiah de Saint-Amour was one of his most dependable customers, and the games of chess were limited to the nights when a new film was not being shown. By then, he and the doctor had become such good friends that they would go to see the films together, but never with the doctor's wife, in part because she did not have the patience to follow the complicated plot lines, and in part because it always seemed to her, through sheer intuition, that Jeremiah de Saint-Amour was not a good companion for anyone. His Sundays were different. He would attend High Mass at the cathedral and then return home to rest and read on the terrace in the patio. He seldom visited a patient on a holy day of obligation, unless it was of extreme urgency, and for many years he had not accepted a social engagement that was not obligatory. On this Pentecost, in a rare coincidence, two extraordinary events had occurred: the death of a friend and the silver anniversary of an eminent pupil. Yet, instead of going straight home as he had intended after certifying the death of Jeremiah de Saint-Amour, he allowed himself to be carried along by curiosity. As soon as he was in his carriage, he again consulted the posthumous letter and told the coachman to take him to an obscure location in the old slave quarter. That decision was so foreign to his usual habits that the coachman wanted to make certain there was no mistake. No mistake. The address was clear, and the man who had written it had more than enough reason to know it very well. Then Dr. Urbino returned to the first page of the letter and plunged once again into the flood of unsavory revelations that might have changed his life, even at his age, if he could have convinced himself that they were not the ravings of a dying man. The sky had begun to threaten very early in the day, and the weather was cloudy and cool, but there was no chance of rain before noon. In his effort to find a shorter route, the coachman braved the rough cobblestones of the colonial city and had to stop often to keep the horse from being frightened by the rowdiness of the religious societies and fraternities coming back from the Pentecost liturgy. The streets were full of paper glans, music, flowers, and girls with colored parasols and muslin ruffles who watched the celebration from their balconies. In the plaza of the cathedral, where the statue of the Liberator was almost hidden among the African palm trees and the globes of the new streetlights, traffic was congested because Mass had ended, and not a seat was empty in the venerable and noisy parish cafe. Dr. Urbino's was the only horse-drawn carriage. It was distinguishable from the handful left in the city because the patent leather roof was always kept polished, and it had fittings of bronze that would not be corroded by salt, and wheels and poles painted red with gilt trimming like gala nights at the Vienna Opera. Furthermore, while the most demanding families were satisfied if their drivers had a clean shirt, he still required his coachman to wear livery of faded velvet and top hat, like a circus ringmaster's, which more than anachronism was thought to show a lack of compassion in the dog days of the Caribbean summer. Despite his almost maniacal love for the city and a knowledge of its superior to anyone's, Dr. Juvenal Urbino had not often had reason as he did that Sunday to venture boldly into the tumult of the old slave quarter. The coachman had to make many turns and stop to ask directions several times in order to find the house. As they passed by the marshes, Dr. Urbino recognized their oppressive weight, their ominous silence, their suffocating gases, which on so many insomniac dawns had risen to his bedroom, blending with the fragrance of jasmine from the patio, and which he felt pass by him like a wind out of yesterday that had nothing to do with his life. But that pestilence, so frequently idealized by nostalgia, became an unbearable reality when the carriage began to lurch through the quagmire of the streets where buzzards fought over the slaughterhouse, awful as it was, swept along by the receding tide. Unlike the city of the viceroys, where the houses were made of masonry, here they were built of weathered boards and zinc roofs, and most of them rested on pilings to protect them from the flooding of the open sewers that had been inherited from the Spaniards. Everything looked wretched and desolate, but out of the sordid taverns came the thunder of riotous music, the godless drunken celebration of Pentecost by the poor. By the time they found the house, gangs of ragged children were chasing the carriage and ridiculing the theatrical finery of the coachman, who had to drive them away with his whip. Dr. Urbino, prepared for a confidential visit, realized too late that there was no innocence more dangerous than the innocence of age. The exterior of the unnumbered house was in no way distinguishable from its fortunate neighbors, except for the window with lace curtains and an opposing front door taken from some old church. The coachman pounded the door knocker, and only when he had made certain that it was the right house did he help the doctor out of the carriage. The door opened without a sound, and in the shadowy interior stood a mature woman dressed in black, with a red rose behind her ear. Despite her age, which was no less than 40, she was still a haughty mulatta with cruel golden eyes and her hair tight to her skull like a helmet of steel wool. Dr. Urbino did not recognize her, although he had seen her several times in the gloom of the chess games in the photographer's studio, and he had once written her a prescription for tertian fever. He held out his hand, and she took it between hers, less in greeting than to help him into the house. The parlor had the climate and invisible murmur of a forest glade, and was crammed with furniture and exquisite objects, each in its natural place. Dr. Urbino recalled without bitterness an antiquarian's shop, number 26 Rue Montmartre, in Paris. On an autumn Monday in the last century, the woman sat down across from him and spoke in accented Spanish. "This is your house, doctor," she said. "I did not expect you so soon." Dr. Urbino felt betrayed. He stared at her openly, at her intense mourning, at the dignity of her grief, and then he understood that this was a useless visit, because she knew more than he did about everything stated and explained in Jeremiah de Saint-Amour's posthumous letter. This was true. She had been with him until a very few hours before his death, as she had been with him for half his life, with a devotion and submissive tenderness that bore too close a resemblance to love, and without anyone knowing anything about it in the sleepy provincial capital, where even state secrets were common knowledge. They had met in a convalescent home in Port-au-Prince, where she had been born and where he had spent his early years as a fugitive. And she had followed him here a year later for a brief visit, although both of them knew without agreeing to anything that she had come to stay forever. She cleaned and straightened the laboratory once a week, but not even the most evil-minded neighbors confused appearance with reality, because they, like everyone else, supposed that Jeremiah de Saint-Amour's disability affected more than his capacity to walk. Dr. Urbino himself supposed as much for solid medical reasons, and never would have believed his friend had a woman if he himself had not revealed it in the letter. In any event, it was difficult for him to comprehend that two free adults without a past and living on the fringes of a closed society's prejudices, had chosen the hazards of illicit love. She explained it was his wish. Moreover, a clandestine life shared with a man who was never completely hers, and in which they often knew the sudden explosion of happiness, did not seem to her a condition to be despised. On the contrary, life had shown her that perhaps it was exemplary. On the previous night, they had gone to the cinema, each one separately, and had sat apart as they had done at least twice a month since the Italian immigrant, Don Galileo da Conte, had installed his open-air theater in the ruins of a 17th century convent. They saw All Quiet on the Western Front, a film based on a book that had been popular the year before and that Dr. Rubino had read, his heart devastated by the barbarian war. They met afterward in the laboratory. She found him brooding and nostalgic, and thought it was because of the brutal scenes of wounded men dying in the mud. In an attempt to distract him, she invited him to play chess, and he accepted to please her. But he played inattentively with the white pieces, of course, until he discovered before she did that he was going to be defeated in 4 moves and surrendered without honor. Then the doctor realized that she had been his opponent in the final game and not General Geronimo Argote, as he had supposed. He murmured in astonishment, "It was masterful." She insisted that she deserved no praise, but rather that Jeremiah de Saint-Amour, already lost in the mists of death, had moved his pieces without love. When he stopped the game at about 11:15, for the music from the public dances had ended, he asked her to leave him. He wanted to write a letter to Dr. Juvenal Urbino, whom he considered the most honorable man he had ever known, and his soul's friend, as he liked to say, despite the fact that the only affinity between the two was their addiction to chess, understood as a dialogue of reason and not as science. And then she knew that Jeremiah de Saint-Amour had come to the end of his suffering, and that he had only enough life to write the letter. The doctor could not believe it. "So then you knew," he exclaimed. She not only knew, she agreed, but she had helped him to endure the suffering as lovingly as she had helped him to discover happiness. Because that was what his last 11 months had been: cruel suffering. "Your duty was to report that," said the doctor. "I could not do that," she said, shocked. "I loved him too much." Dr. Urbino, who thought he had heard everything, had never heard anything like that, and said with such simplicity, he looked straight at her and tried with all his senses to fix her in his memory as she was at that moment. She seemed like a river idol, undaunted in her black dress, with her serpent's eyes and the rose behind her ear. A long time ago, on a deserted beach in Haiti, where the two of them lay naked after love, Jeremiah de Saint-Amour had sighed, "I will never be old." She interpreted this as a heroic determination to struggle without quarter against the ravages of time. But he was more specific. He had made the irrevocable decision to take his own life when he was 60 years old. He had turned 60, in fact, on the 23rd of January of that year. And then he had set the date as the night before Pentecost, the most important holiday in a city consecrated to the cult of the Holy Spirit. There was not a single detail of the previous night that she had not known about ahead of time, and they spoke of it often, suffering together the irreparable rush of days that neither of them could stop now. Jeremiah de Saint-Amour loved life with a senseless passion. He loved the sea and love. He loved his dog and her. And as the date approached, he had gradually succumbed to despair, as if his death had been not his own decision, but an inexorable destiny. "Last night, when I left him, he was no longer of this world," she said. She had wanted to take the dog with her, but he looked at the animal dozing beside the crutches and caressed him with the tips of his fingers. He said, "I'm sorry, but Mr. Woodrow Wilson is coming with me." He asked her to tie him to the leg of the cot while he wrote, and she used a false knot so that he could free himself. That had been her only act of disloyalty, and it was justified by her desire to remember the master in the wintry eyes of his dog. But Dr. Urbino interrupted her to say that the dog had not freed himself. She said that it was because he did not want to. And she was glad, because she preferred to evoke her dead lover as he had asked her to the night before, when he stopped writing the letter he had already begun and looked at her for the last time. "Remember me with a rose," he said to her. She had returned home a little after midnight. She lay down fully dressed on her bed to smoke one cigarette after another and give him time to finish what she knew was a long and difficult letter. And a little before 3 o'clock, when the dogs began to howl, she put the water for coffee on the stove, dressed in full mourning, and got the first rose of dawn in the patio. Dr. Urbino already realized how completely he would repudiate the memory of that irredeemable woman, and he thought he knew why. Only a person without principles could be so complacent toward grief. And for the remainder of the visit, she gave him even more justification. She would not go to the funeral, for that is what she had promised her lover, although Dr. Urbino thought he had read just the opposite in one of the paragraphs of the letter. She would not shed a tear. She would not waste the rest of her years simmering in the maggot broth of memory. She would not bury herself alive inside these four walls to sew her shroud as native widows were expected to do. She intended to sell Jeremiah de Saint Amour's house and all its contents, which according to the letter now belonged to her. And its contents, and she would go on living as she always had without complaining in this death trap of the poor where she had been happy. The words pursued Dr. Juvenal Urbino on the drive home. This death trap of the poor. It was not a gratuitous description, for the city, his city, stood unchanging on the edge of time. The same burning dry city of his nocturnal terrors and the solitary pleasures of purity, where flowers rusted and salt corroded, where nothing had happened for 4 centuries except a slow aging among withered laurels and putrefying swamps. In winter, sudden devastating downpours flooded the latrines and turned the streets into sickening bogs. In summer, an invisible dust as harsh as red-hot chalk was blown into even the best protected corners of the imagination by mad winds that took the roofs off the houses and carried away children through the air. On Saturdays, the poor mulattoes, along with all other domestic animals and kitchen utensils, tumultuously abandoned their hovels of cardboard and tin on the edges of the swamps, and jubilant assault took over the rocky beaches of the colonial district. Until a few years ago, some of the older ones still bore the royal slave brand that had been burned into their chests with flaming irons. During the weekend, they danced without mercy, drank themselves blind on home-brewed alcohol, made wild love among the icaco plants, and on Saturdays at midnight they broke up their own party with bloody free-for-alls. During the rest of the week, the same impetuous mob swarmed into the plazas and alleys of the old neighborhoods with their stores of everything that could be bought and sold, and they infused the dead city with the frenzy of a human fair reeking of fried fish. A new life. Independence from Spain and then the abolition of slavery precipitated the conditions of honorable decadence in which Dr. Juvenal Urbino had been born and raised. The great old families sank into their ruined palaces in silence. Along the rough cobbled streets that had served so well in surprise attacks and buccaneers' landings, weeds hung from the balconies and open cracks in the whitewashed walls of even the best kept mansions, and the only signs of life at 2:00 in the afternoon were languid piano exercises played in the dim light of siesta. Indoors, in the cool bedrooms, Saturated with incense, women protected themselves from the sun as if it were a shameful infection. And even at early Mass, they hid their faces in their mantillas. Their love affairs were slow and difficult, and were often disturbed by sinister omens, and life seemed interminable. At nightfall, at the oppressive moment of transition, a storm of carnivorous mosquitoes rose out of the swamps, and a tender breath of human shit, warm and sad, stirred the certainty of death in the depths of one's soul. And so the very life of the colonial city, which the young Juvenal Urbino tended to idealize in his Parisian melancholy, was an illusion of memory. In the 18th century, the commerce of the city had been the most prosperous in the Caribbean, owing in the main to the thankless privilege of its being the largest African slave market in the Americas. It was also the permanent residence of the viceroys of the new kingdom of Grenada, who preferred to govern here on the shores of the world's ocean rather than in the distant, freezing capital under centuries of old drizzle that disturbed their sense of reality. Several times a year, fleets of galleons carried the treasures of Potosi, Quito, and Veracruz, gathered in the bay, and the city lived its years of glory. On Friday, June 8th, 1708, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the galleon San Jose set for Cadiz with a cargo of precious stones and metals valued at 500 billion pesos in the currency of the day. It was sunk by an English squadron at the entrance to the port, and 2 long centuries later, it had not yet been salvaged. That treasure lying in its bed of coral, and the corpse of the commander floating sideways on the bridge, were evoked by historians as an emblem of the city drowned in memories. Across the bay, in the residential district of La Manga, Dr. Juvenal Urbino's house stood in another time, one story, spacious and cool. It had a portico with Doric columns on the outside terrace, which commanded a view of the still miasmic water and the debris from sunken ships in the bay. From the entrance door to the kitchen, the floor was covered with black and white checkerboard tiles, a fact often attributed to Dr. Urbino's ruling passion, without taking into account that this was a weakness common to the Catalonian craftsmen who built this district for the Nouveau Riche at the beginning of the century. The large drawing room had the very high ceilings found throughout the rest of the house, and 6 full-length windows facing the street, and it was separated from the dining room by an enormous, elaborate glass door covered with branching vines and bunches of grapes, and maidens seduced by the pipes of fauns in a bronze grove. furnishings in the reception rooms, including the pendulum clock that stood like a living sentinel in the drawing room, were all original English pieces from the late 19th century, and the lamps that hung from the walls were all teardrop crystal. And there were Sèvres vases and bowls everywhere, and little alabaster statues of pagan idols. But what European coherence vanished in the rest of the house were wicker armchairs were jumbled together with Viennese rockers and leather footstools made by local craftsmen, splendid hammocks from San Jacinto with multicolored fringe along the sides, and the owner's name embroidered in Gothic letters with silk thread hung in the bedrooms along with the beds. Next to the dining room, the space that had originally been designed for gala suppers was used as a small music room for intimate concerts when famous performers came to the city. In order to enhance the silence, the tiles had been covered with the Turkish rugs purchased at the World's Fair in Paris. A recent model of Victrola stood next to a stand that held records arranged with care. And in a corner, draped with a manila shawl, was the piano that Dr. Urbino had not played for many years. Throughout the house, one could detect the good sense and care of a woman whose feet were planted firmly on the ground. But no other room displayed the meticulous solemnity of the library, the sanctuary of Dr. Urbino until old age carried him off. There, all around his father's walnut desk and the tufted leather easy chairs, he had lined the walls and even the windows with shelves behind glass doors, and had arranged in an almost demented order the 3,000 volumes bound in identical calfskin with his initials in gold on the spine. Unlike the other rooms, which were at the mercy of noise and foul winds from the port, the library always enjoyed that tranquility and fragrance of an abbey. Born and raised in the Caribbean superstition that one opened doors and windows to summon a coolness that in fact did not exist, Dr. Urbino and his wife at first felt their hearts oppressed by enclosure, but in the end they were convinced of the merits of the Roman strategy against heat, which consists of closing houses during the lethargy of August in order to keep out the burning air from the street, and then opening them up completely to the night breezes. And from that time on, theirs was the coolest house under the furious La Manga sun, and it was the delight to take a siesta in the darkened bedrooms and to sit on the portico in the afternoon to watch the heavy, ash-gray freighters from New Orleans pass by, and at dusk to see the wooden paddles of the riverboats with their shining lights, purifying the stagnant garbage heap of the bay with the wake of their music. It was also the best protected from December through March, when the northern winds tore away roofs and spent the night circling like hungry wolves, looking for a crack where they could slip in. No one ever thought that a marriage rooted in such foundations could have any reason not to be happy. Okay, we'll continue next time. I hope you're sleeping.